Do you hear that?" Vylor Dren's voice cut through the War Council's chamber like a blade across old armor, rough and unyielding. "That isn't the silence of victory. It's the quiet before a storm you don't see coming." The council chamber, a domed colossus of darkened steel and pulsating energy conduits, buzzed with quiet murmurs. The air was thick, not with tension, but with dismissal. Vylor knew the look in their eyes. He had seen it 100 times before. The arrogance of species that had never lost a war. The kind of certainty that got men killed. Supreme High Commander Zivak sat at the head of the long, curving war table, his clawed fingers tracing the glowing star charts on the laser plasma display before him. His bioluminescent facial ridges flared briefly, a sign of amusement, not concern. "Vylor, you've fought too many wars to know peace, haven't you?" The laughter in the chamber was quiet, restrained, but there. Like predators amused by the sight of an old hound still growling at shadows. Vylor ignored them. He stepped forward, letting the heavy clank of his armored boots echo against the chamber floor. His scarred carapace, dulled with age and old battles, was a stark contrast to the pristine uniforms of the younger officers. "You think the humans will fight like the last ones?" His golden eyes swept the room, meeting no challengers. Like prey waiting for slaughter? Like cattle in a pen? He let the question linger, the weight of it seeping into the cracks of their overconfidence. Zivak leaned back in his command chair, exhaling through flared nostrils. The glow of the Council's laser plasma displays reflected in his eyes, giving him an almost bored expression. They are scattered, divided, technologically primitive. Vylor's fingers curled into a fist, his jaw tightening. They let you think that. He slammed his hand onto the war table, sending ripples through the floating star charts. Some of the younger officers flinched at the impact. Their world is a death trap, a place that kills even its own. They've survived everything that should have wiped them out. Plagues, wars, self-destruction. And you think they will break under this? Zivak waved a dismissive hand. "Our intelligence reports confirm their fleet is barely capable of interstellar war. Their ships are crude, their orbital defenses obsolete." "And yet," Vylor snapped, stepping closer, his voice a low growl, "you don't ask why they have survived, despite those weaknesses." A silence settled over the room, heavier now. Zivak exhaled through his nostrils again, but this time it lacked its earlier amusement. He tapped a few controls, shifting the display to a projection of Earth's solar system. A calculated invasion route flickered on the screen, the Coalition's fleet marked as an unstoppable wave of light. "Our warships will enter their system undetected. Their early warning systems are laughable. We will strike before they even know we're there." Vylor's mandibles twitched in frustration. "Strike where?" His voice carried the weight of experience, the weight of too many wars lost to men like Zivak. "On their strongholds? Their capital cities? You assume they will wait for you to come." He gestured toward the glowing battle plan hovering before them. "You march into their home and expect them to fight on your terms." His voice darkened. "They won't." An officer on the council, young, eager, dressed in the polished uniform of the newer war breed, sighed and folded his arms. "Then enlighten us, old warrior. How will they fight?" Vylor turned to face him fully, stepping forward until only inches separated them. His scarred face was close enough for the young officer to see the dull edges of old wounds along his mandibles. "They will turn every weakness into a weapon," Vylor said quietly. Every assumption you have made about them will be your undoing. You believe they lack unity? That means you won't see the strike when it comes. You believe they lack the technology? That means you won't recognize the weapons when they tear your fleets apart. And worst of all, he leaned in, his voice dropping lower. You think they will fight like us, like you. The young officer's ridges flickered uncertainly, but he held his ground. Then what do you suggest? That we call off the invasion because of ghost stories? Vaelor's throat rumbled. He forced himself to straighten. No, he admitted. You're too far gone for that. You've already convinced yourselves of victory. He turned back toward the war table, looking at the glowing paths of their invasion plans, the sweeping arrows of calculated conquest. I am telling you this because I want you to remember. Remember that I tried to stop this. When your dreadnoughts start disappearing without a trace, when your soldiers turn on each other because their minds have been broken, when you finally realize you were never the hunter. He tapped the war table one final time. Remember this moment. Zavak's ridges darkened in irritation. He exhaled sharply, pushing himself up from his seat. Enough. His deep voice silenced the murmurs in the room. Vaelor, you are dismissed. For a long moment, the old warrior did not move. Then, finally, he turned on his heel, his boots striking against the floor with slow, deliberate force. The doors of the chamber hissed open before him, and the dim glow of the corridor beyond swallowed him whole. No one stopped him. No one called him back. They were still laughing when the doors sealed shut behind him. The corridor outside the war chamber was colder than he remembered. Or maybe that was just the weight of old bones, of experience ignored. Vaelor walked without urgency, his claws brushing absent-mindedly against the hilt of his ceremonial blade strapped to his hip. His quarters were sparsely furnished. The dim glow of an active heads-up display flickered against the far wall, cycling through fleet readouts and invasion prep orders. He paid them little attention. His mind was elsewhere. He pressed a claw to his temple, activating the secure channel he had set up days ago. The signal went out. A delay. Then a response. A human voice crackled through the receiver. The language was clean, efficient. I assume they didn't listen. Vaelor exhaled slowly. They never do. Silence. Then, finally, the human spoke again. Then we begin. Vaelor's fingers tightened around the receiver. He stared at the fleet readouts, at the glowing projections of coalition warships advancing toward Earth. And, for the first time in his life, he felt something close to pity. Because Zavak was right about one thing. The humans were waiting, and they were ready. The dominion of order, the pride of the coalition fleet, drifted above the swirling blue sphere of Earth, surrounded by its armada. Sleek warships poised like drawn blades, their hulls glinting under the raw light of the distant star. From his command throne, High Commander Zavak observed the laser plasma displays detailing every inch of the operation. Flawless, every landing zone accounted for, orbital defenses minimal, no human fleet in sight. The invasion was already won. And yet, a small voice at the back of his mind, unbidden, unwanted, echoed the words of an old war veteran. You think they will fight like us. He exhaled sharply and dismissed the thought. Zavak turned toward his bridge officers, their bioluminescent markings flickering in crisp patterns of efficiency. Initiate planetary descent. Secure their capital cities. Break their resistance before it can form. His second-in-command, Commander Luther, tapped several commands into his interface. Deploying dropships. We should have control of their largest settlements within the cycle. And still, Nothing from the humans. No panic. No desperate transmissions. Not even the expected scramble of their primitive fleets. It was almost too easy. "Scan for anomalies," Zivak ordered, his ridges darkening slightly. "They must be hiding something." The Dominion's long-range scanners swept across the planet's surface, dissecting data, searching for the slightest disruption. The heads-up display flickered, adjusting its readings. Then, all at once, the numbers unraveled. Every ship, every relay, every system linked to the fleet was infected. Glitches spread like wildfire across the laser plasma displays, corrupting formation readings, distorting ship positions. Dropship signals twisted into static. Weapons locked onto empty space. Power fluctuations coursed through even the most secure systems. And for the first time, Zivak felt it. A presence. Not an enemy fleet, not an armed force waiting to engage, but something colder. Something watching. Before he could issue a command, the first warship went dark. No explosion, no weapons fire, just silence. The Harbinger, one of the largest dreadnoughts in the fleet, flickered out of existence. One moment a towering war machine, the next a drifting husk. Zivak's throat tightened. Status on the Harbinger? Luther's fingers darted across the console, his face suddenly drawn. No response, no energy signatures. It's as if... He hesitated, unwilling to speak the words aloud. It's as if it died. The word died was wrong. Ships did not die. They were destroyed, overrun, decommissioned. This was something else. On the far side of the formation, another warship dimmed, its engines flickering, its running lights guttering into nothingness. Then another, and another. Zivak gripped the armrests of his throne. What in the void is happening? Luther's voice had lost its steadiness. We've lost contact with 7 capital ships in the last 2 minutes. No distress signals. No external damage. The Dominion of Order shuddered. Just once, but enough to send a ripple of unease through the bridge crew. Zivak turned toward the nearest viewport. A freighter, a rusted, half-functioning human freighter, was drifting just beyond their forward lines. Zivak's mandibles twitched in disgust. That ship doesn't belong here. Luther ran a quick scan. Confirmed human vessel. No active weapons detected. He hesitated, then frowned at his display. Wait, there's something wrong with the... A white-hot detonation erupted from the freighter, but not an explosion in the traditional sense. There was no fireball, no concussive wave tearing through space. Instead, an electromagnetic burst surged outward, enveloping everything in its path. The Dominion's laser plasma displays flickered violently. The heads-up interfaces spasmed with error messages. Every Coalition warship caught in the blast's radius lurched, not from impact, but from sudden power failure. Then the real nightmare began. The laser plasma display in front of Zivak restructured into an unfamiliar transmission. A voice, human, raw, and deliberate, spoke through the interference, cutting through the static like a blade through flesh. "We see you." 3 words, simple, uncomplicated. But the weight of them settled deep into Zivak's chest like ice. The bridge fell silent. Every officer, every soldier, every hardened warrior aboard the Dominion of Order stood motionless, trapped in the realization that they were no longer the ones in control. "Trace the signal," Zivak ordered, forcing his voice into something resembling command. Luther worked furiously at the controls. It's bouncing between relay points. It's impossible to pinpoint. That was when the first weapons fire finally came. Not from the humans, from the Coalition's own fleet. The Iron Fang, a heavy war cruiser, veered suddenly off course, its main batteries turning inward, firing into the nearest ally ship without warning. The Vindicator responded by returning fire, its automated defense grid activating as if its own war fleet had become the enemy. Across the Dominion's displays, entire battle groups collapsed into madness. "They're making us shoot ourselves," an officer shouted. Zevac's ridges pulsed wildly. "Counter-hack their systems, cut off their auto-targeting." Luthar's hands blurred across his console. "I'm trying. They've injected false enemy signatures into our targeting arrays." Zevac's mind raced. The humans had no fleet, no warships that should have been capable of this, and yet their forces were evaporating, not through battle, through subterfuge. Vylor's words returned to him, cold and biting. "They will turn every weakness into a weapon." The Dominion's internal security alarms erupted in a blaring cascade. Zevac turned sharply, his breath catching. "Now what?" Luther paled. "We have breaches." Internal Zevac's throat tightened. "Explain." The officer swallowed. "The freighters. We let some of them dock before the attack. We thought—" He hesitated. "We thought they were derelict." Zevac closed his eyes, the full horror settling in. They were never derelict. They were delivery vessels. For war. A sharp crackle burst from the Dominion's internal comms. Then a second voice. A different human, grittier, with the edge of a soldier who had fought in places no one should have survived. "This ship is ours now." Then the Dominion of Order shuddered, but this time Zevac knew. It was not from an external attack. It was from inside. Zevac's claws dug into the arms of his command throne as another section of the Dominion of Order flickered red on the heads-up display. The ship trembled, not from enemy fire, not from external forces, but from the slow, deliberate rot sinking into its core. The human infiltrators were inside. The officers around him moved with frantic energy, their bioluminescent markings flickering in distress as they scrambled to regain control. The ship's atmosphere had changed. The cold, clinical efficiency of a warship replaced by a creeping, unseen infection. Commander Luther's voice was tight with restrained panic. Security forces report multiple breaches, their overriding access panels, cutting through blast doors like they were made of sand. Zevac exhaled through gritted teeth. "How many?" Luther hesitated. Zevac's ridges flared in warning. "Don't think. Tell me." Luthar's eyes twitched toward the display. "We don't know." That single phrase carried more weight than any fleet battle. Zevac forced himself to stand, adjusting the ceremonial blade at his side. He had expected resistance, but this wasn't war. It was slow suffocation, an enemy crawling into the ship's lungs and squeezing the air from it, unseen and unstoppable. The overhead lights flickered. A voice, calm, too calm, spoke over the ship's internal comms. "Your bridge is quiet, High Commander. I expected more shouting." The words slithered into Zevac's mind like cold iron. "Trace that signal," he snapped. Luther worked furiously, his fingers a blur across the console. "It's bouncing through auxiliary relays." Zevac silenced him with a raised hand. He turned to the room, his gaze sweeping across his bridge officers. "Listen to me. This is not a collapse. This is not an ending. We are warriors. We take back control." He tapped into the ship-wide command frequency, his voice ringing through every corridor. "Security teams, regroup. Defensive protocols. Lock all access points. They think they are inside our house. Show them what happens to intruders." For a moment there was silence, Then responses flooded the channel. Affirmations, rallying cries. Zivak turned back to Luther. Cut off all power to non-essential sectors. Starve them of air, light, everything. Make this ship uninhabitable. Luthar hesitated. That will kill our own stranded personnel. Zivak's ridges darkened. And if we do nothing, we all die. Luthar swallowed but obeyed. The Dominion shifted under their feet as entire decks went dark. Zivak could almost hear the cold rush of vacuum biting into the ship's arteries, feel the way the halls would be falling silent, one by one. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe they were regaining control. Then the ship shuddered. Hard. The external heads-up display flared with new warnings. It wasn't human weapons fire. The fleet was killing itself. The Iron Fang, already compromised by the electronic warfare infiltration, had turned its broadside cannons against the Vindicator, blasting through its engine block. The Vindicator's crew, panicked and unable to override their corrupted systems, returned fire before their ship detonated in a violent rupture of atmosphere and flame. Zivak watched, rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. How are they making us turn on each other? Luthar's hands trembled as he scrolled through intercepted data. They're feeding us misinformation, spliced distress signals, fabricated enemy signatures. Our own ships are seeing each other as hostiles. Then override it. Luthar's jaw tightened. That's what they want. If we try to force a system reboot, they might have a kill switch embedded in the code. Zivak exhaled sharply. The human infiltration wasn't just a direct attack, it was a labyrinth of traps. Every solution came with a risk, and then, through the static of failing comms, the voice returned. You are running out of moves, High Commander. Zivak's mandibles clenched. Coward, show yourself. The voice was quiet, amused. I already have. Zivak's ridges tensed. Something was wrong. The ship wasn't just failing, it was bleeding. The realization struck cold in his gut. The power failures, the sudden loss of key systems. It wasn't just sabotage. The humans weren't disabling the ship. They were rewiring it. Luther gasped. They've rerouted the Dominion's power grid. The lights on the bridge flickered violently. The main heads-up display collapsed into static. Then, in the darkness, a new display bloomed. Not Coalition code. Not the ordered efficiency of their war systems. A human interface. A message blinked in front of them, written in the language of their enemy. You thought you were on the battlefield. You were in a trap the moment you arrived. Silence consumed the bridge. Zivak stood motionless, his throat tight. How long had they been inside? How long had they been watching, waiting, letting the coalition think they were winning, only to pull the floor out from beneath them? Luthar's voice came in a whisper. Sir, our weapons systems are locked out. Zivak's chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths. He turned to his officers, voice steady, but waited. Prepare to evacuate non-combat personnel. This ship may not last the night. Luther swallowed. Sir, Zivak cut him off. Do not question. Do not hesitate. If this ship falls, I will not have my warriors trapped in it. A soft chime broke through the silence. The human voice returned, slower now. Smart choice. And then the Dominion's artificial gravity failed. The entire bridge lurched as bodies lifted into the air, scrambling for anything to hold on to. Consoles sparked, sending embers drifting in weightlessness. Zivak slammed into the bulkhead, pain lancing through his ribs. He gritted his teeth and forced himself upright. His eyes found the main viewport. Through the chaos, the human fleet had emerged. Not in formation, Not in the clean, coordinated discipline of the coalition. They came like predators from the dark, silent, unseen, everywhere. Zivak watched as his fleet, his invincible, unconquerable war machine, was no longer the aggressor. It was prey. The Dominion trembled once more, and then the human fleet opened fire. Zivak's claws gripped the bulkhead as weightlessness stole the stability from his body. The Dominion of order twisted, caught in the slow, suffocating spiral of a dying warship. Flames flickered in the bridge's dim light, embers rising in graceful arcs, weightless, as if mocking the chaos that gripped his crew. The enemy had turned their own ship against them, not with brute force, not with overwhelming firepower, but with patience, with a plan that had been seeded before the First Fleet even left Coalition space. The human fleet had finally revealed itself, too late for them to counter. Luther floated nearby, his eyes locked onto the heads-up display, where fractured data streams flickered in disarray. "We've lost structural control over 2/3 of the ship," he rasped, voice strained with the effort of stabilizing himself. "Gravity systems are offline. Shield integrity is collapsing. We're trapped." Zivak finished the thought for him. The bridge trembled as another human strike slammed into the outer hull. It wasn't a direct kill shot. No, the humans weren't finishing them. They were disassembling the ship, piece by piece, letting it bleed out rather than crushing it in one decisive blow. The comms unit crackled again. The voice returned, deep and cold, delivered without urgency. "You could have turned back. You could have listened. But now you learn." A flicker of static, a beat of silence. Then a new sound, screaming. Zivak's ridges darkened as the transmission continued, feeding him his own fleet's death cries. The Harbinger's bridge officers were shouting over each other, their ship drowning in some unseen force. Another fragment. Coalition soldiers locked inside a corridor, pounding on sealed blast doors as the atmosphere vented around them. Their gasps came sharp and quick, fading into nothing. The humans had weaponized fear itself. Zivak's mandibles clenched. Cut the transmission. Luther hesitated before shutting off the comms, but the damage was done. The silence felt heavier now. "How do we fight this?" Luthar's voice was tight. "We can't shoot what we can't see. They're using our own fleet against us." Zivak exhaled slowly, forcing his mind to steady itself. "They are not the ones making us destroy ourselves. That is our weakness." A new realization settled in his gut like molten lead. The battle was not just happening here, it was happening everywhere. His gaze snapped to the external display, where the remnants of the coalition fleet struggled to hold their formations. It was unraveling. Frigate-class vessels, confused and disoriented by human interference, crashed into one another. Battleships fired blindly at phantoms that weren't there. Several ships had already broken formation, fleeing the battlefield in a desperate attempt to escape a war that had never gone according to plan. This wasn't an invasion. It was eradication. "Sir," Luthar swallowed, his ridges twitching. "Command is requesting surrender protocols." Zivak turned sharply, his gaze locking onto the officer. "Repeat that." Luther hesitated. "Fleet command. They're compromised. The human forces have cut off our tactical relays. We're fighting blind. They want to negotiate terms before the slaughter became total." Zivak straightened, rolling his shoulders, flexing his claws to feel the weight of his own strength. "No," he said firmly. "No surrender. We are warriors, not scavengers begging for mercy at the first sign of hardship." Luthar hesitated. If we continue, sir, this won't just be a defeat. It will be an execution. Zivak inhaled slowly, then exhaled through flared nostrils. Then we changed the terms. He moved toward the main bridge console, gripping the emergency controls. They think we are broken. They think we will kneel. But they forget. When the prey knows it is dying, that is when it bites the hardest. Luthar's eyes widened. What are you planning? Zivak keyed in a new command sequence. If they want to dismantle us piece by piece, his ridges flared. Then let us remind them that even broken machines can explode. The ship's reactor core pulsed on the heads-up display. The kill switch was set. Zivak straightened. His voice came steady. We drive this ship into them. Luthar hesitated. Sir, they have taken everything from us except one thing. Zivak's golden eyes burned. Choice. For the first time since the battle began, control returned to his hands. If the humans wanted to unmake them, then he would make sure they paid for it in fire. He reached for the final command, and then, suddenly, stillness. The ship stopped moving. Not from impact, not from external force. It was held. The Dominion of Order, one of the most powerful warships in the Coalition, had been seized mid-flight. Zivak's breath stilled. He turned, slowly, toward the external heads-up display. There, outside the viewport, was something new. It was not a human warship. It was not like anything in the Coalition's records. The structure was dark, almost featureless, built not for war, but for something worse. A warship designed not to conquer, but to contain. A command station. A prison. And it had ensnared them. Luthar's voice came out in a whisper. What is that? Zivak's ridges twitched. The real trap. The humans had never intended to wipe them out in a single engagement. No, they had been guiding them, herding them toward this moment. A controlled destruction. Not all of them would die. Some would watch, some would be kept. For the first time in his life, Zivak felt it. The true weight of losing. The comms flickered. A new voice, one that did not taunt, did not sneer. It simply spoke. Welcome to your lesson. Zivak exhaled, his claws loosening. They had never been at war. They had been studied. And now the lesson would begin. Zivak's breath came slow and measured, but the weight in his chest was unbearable. The Dominion of Order, the ship that had once embodied the might of the Coalition, now drifted like a lifeless carcass in the cold. Not destroyed, not disabled, contained. The humans had never sought a battle. They had orchestrated a collapse. Outside the bridge viewport, the war was ending before his eyes. Coalition ships still fired in erratic bursts, some attempting to flee, others succumbing to hysteria. No coordination, no command structure. Just fragments of what had once been an empire's spearhead. And the humans, they waited. They did not strike to kill. They let the Coalition fleets spiral further into their own undoing. Every misfire, every ship lost to a collision or sabotage was another victory. Not theirs, but the enemy's own failure. Zivak's hands curled into fists. This was not war. It was discipline. The heads-up display crackled. Another transmission. No distorted voice, no cryptic taunt. A face. Human. Weathered. Scarred. A soldier, but something more than that. Not a tactician, not a commander, a witness. The man studied Zivak with an expression bordering on pity. The way one might look at a wounded predator, bleeding out but still bearing its fangs. You've been given every chance to turn back, the human said. His voice held no hatred, no anger, just inevitability. You refused. Zivak straightened, ignoring the ache in his ribs. Surrender is not our way. A slow nod. The human seemed to consider this, rolling his shoulders slightly as if the weight of the moment didn't sit entirely on one side. "I know," he said. "That's why we never asked." Zivak's ridges twitched. Something about the phrasing dug deeper than he liked. The display flickered again, this time shifting to multiple feeds. The wreckage of his fleet. The derelict husks of warships, stranded and leaderless. The last transmissions of coalition officers speaking in hushed, fearful tones. A voice in the background almost whispered, "There's nowhere to go." Zivak clenched his jaw. "If you wanted us dead, we would be." The human exhaled through his nose, leaning slightly forward. "You still think this is about war. Then what is it about?" The human tapped a control on his side. The feed changed again. It was not the battlefield. It was coalition space. Zivak's heart stilled. Homeworlds. His homeworld appeared on the screen. Not burning, not blockaded, but silent. Not a single transmission. No signs of activity. No departing ships. No incoming reinforcements. "Your war ended before you left your borders," the human said, watching the realization settle over Zivak's features. "We didn't fight your fleets. We fought your infrastructure." Zivak's claws dug into his palms. "That's impossible." "No," the human said. "It's already done." Zivak turned sharply to Luther, whose face was pale beneath his bioluminescent markings. "Confirm this." Luther fumbled at the controls, cycling through coalition data streams. Every request was met with silence. The few signals that did return were corrupted, looping old messages from before the invasion had even begun. The coalition wasn't responding. Zivak took a slow step back. The humans hadn't just won a battle, they had removed the coalition from the equation entirely. It had never been about destroying their fleet. It had been about making it irrelevant. The human on the display waited, watching the weight of that truth settle over his enemy. Zivak's breaths came shallower now, something inside him unraveling. His people had assumed humanity would break first, that their inexperience with galactic warfare would doom them. Instead, the humans had watched, had waited, had learned, and in the end they hadn't fought like the coalition. They had fought better. Zivak turned back to the display, his body tight with unspoken rage. "If you expect us to kneel—" "We don't," the human interrupted. Silence stretched between them. And then the human said the words that sent a fresh chill through Zivak's veins. "We are not your executioners." His ridges flared. "Then what are you?" The human leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "Your keepers." The weight of the statement cracked through the bridge like a silent detonation. Zivak's mind reeled, searching for meaning. They had been caught, contained. Their homeworlds had been severed from them. Their fleets had been reduced to relics before they even knew they were obsolete. This was not a conquest. It was a sentence. Luthar's voice was barely a whisper. They aren't taking over." He looked at Zivak with something bordering on horror. "They're locking us in." The human exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "Your war machine is dead, High Commander," he said. "Your empire will not expand beyond the borders it has now. No more invasions, no more conquests. You'll keep what you have, nothing more." Zivak's throat tightened. "And if we refuse?" The human studied him. Then, with quiet finality, he said, "Then we wait." The meaning was crystal clear. There was no war to fight anymore. There was only the choice, to accept their place in this new order, or to let time do the work the humans no longer needed to. Zivak's claws curled. You think you can chain us forever? The human's expression darkened. No chains. He glanced at the display. No walls, just the understanding that if you try this again. He let the silence stretch. Zivak already knew the answer. There would be no next war. Not because the coalition wouldn't try, but because humanity would never let it start. The heads-up display flickered once more. A final message, text scrolling across in calm, deliberate strokes. This is not surrender. This is acceptance. The transmission cut. The display faded. Zivak stared at the empty screen, his pulse a steady, thunderous drum in his skull. He had never lost before. But this wasn't loss. This was irrelevance. He turned to Luther, his voice lower than a whisper. Get me a line to what remains of our fleet. Luther swallowed, but obeyed. The screen flickered again. The remaining commanders, those who had survived, stared back at him. And for the first time in his life, Zivak did not know what order to give, because there were no more battles left to fight, and the enemy had left them with nothing but time. Zivak stood at the center of the dominion of Order's bridge, his shoulders rigid, his mind hollow. The ship's once pristine command deck was bathed in the weak flicker of emergency lighting. The heads-up display in front of him had gone dark. The human message burned into his memory. This is not surrender. This is acceptance. Silence stretched between him and the remaining fleet commanders. Their faces, hollowed by exhaustion, ridges dimmed in shock, stared back at him from fractured comm feeds. They were waiting, not for orders, not for strategy, for meaning. Zivak inhaled slowly, feeling the tightness in his chest, the weight of realization pressing down on his ribs. His entire life had been built on the foundation that war was inevitable. That strength dictated survival. That conquest was the only path forward. But now there was nowhere to go. Luther shifted beside him, the quiet rasp of his breath the only sound in the broken bridge. "High Commander," he said, voice hoarse, "what do we do?" Zivak's claws flexed against his palms. He had spent years perfecting tactics, memorizing battle formations, preparing for the kind of war the coalition had fought for centuries. But there was no strategy for this. He turned his gaze back to the display. What remained of the fleet drifted in ruin. Some ships had powered down entirely, left to drift like tombs. Others still had life, their commanders waiting for something, orders, absolution, purpose. Zivak forced himself to speak. "We regroup." Luther hesitated. "To what end?" Zivak's jaw tightened. "We return to what's left of our territory. We assess the damage." He did not say we rebuild, because there was no rebuilding from this. Luther seemed to realize it at the same time, his expression shifting, ridges twitching with unspoken frustration. And then Zivak exhaled. "Then we wait." Luther turned away, fists clenching. He did not argue. There was nothing to argue against. The comm feed flickered again, one of the fleet commanders finally finding his voice. "High Commander," he said, his ridges twitching in unease. "The humans, what do they gain from this?" Zivak studied the battered remains of his once mighty armada. "Control." Another officer scoffed, voice laced with anger. "If they wanted control, they would have taken our territory. They would have occupied our worlds." Zivak shook his head. "No." He turned, locking eyes with the other commanders through the fractured screen. "They don't need to take our worlds. They've turned them into cages." The silence deepened. One by one, the realization dawned. The coalition's empire still existed, but it was no longer expanding. The humans had not defeated them in battle. They had crippled their future. Luthar's voice came quiet. They won't let us leave our borders again. Zavak's ridges darkened. They don't have to. We no longer have the means to expand. Our supply chains are in ruins. Our command structure is fragmented. And if we attempt another war— He didn't need to finish the sentence. The humans had not wiped them out, but they had shown them what would happen if they tried again. A heavy pause settled over the bridge, the weight of finality pressing down on all of them. Luthar exhaled sharply. And if we defy them? Zavak turned toward the viewport, staring out at the dark. The human fleet was still there, distant shadows lurking beyond the wreckage, watching, waiting for them to make a choice. We won't, Zavak said finally. Not now, not soon, his voice lowered, but one day. Luthar's ridges twitched. You think we'll rise again? Zavak let the silence stretch before answering. I think we'll remember this. Luthar frowned. They think they've won. They have won, Zavak corrected. For now. He turned back to his officers, his warriors, his people. They had been defeated, caged, made irrelevant. But irrelevance was not the same as extinction. The humans had given them time, and time was a weapon. One they would wield again. One day. For now, they had no choice but to play their role in this new galaxy, to accept. But accepting did not mean forgetting. Zavak's claws flexed. Set course for the nearest remaining outpost. His voice was even, quiet. We regroup, we survive. Luthar hesitated, then nodded. The dominion of order, broken but not dead, turned toward the void. And in the distance, the humans watched. Waiting. Ensuring that the lesson had been learned. The dominion of order limped through space, the remnants of its once imposing hull scorched and battered. Inside, the corridors still bore the scars of battle. Carbon-scored walls, exposed conduits sparking intermittently, bodies of fallen warriors secured in stasis chambers until they could be honored properly. Zavak stood at the central command deck, eyes fixed on the heads-up display. The fleet's trajectory was locked onto the last known operational outpost, a deep space station known as Akar Bastion, one of the few coalition facilities not yet severed by the human intervention, if it still stood. Luthar's voice was quiet but firm. Our long-range relays still aren't responding. They won't, Zavak muttered. Not after what we've seen. The humans had done more than disable the coalition's infrastructure. They had rearranged it. Supply chains weren't just severed. They had been redirected into black holes of miscommunication, false data trails, and corrupted relay nodes. The systems that once held their empire together now worked against them, and yet Akar Bastion had remained silent. Zavak exhaled sharply. Estimate on arrival. Luthar checked his readout. 3 hours. He hesitated. If it's compromised, we will know soon enough. Zavak turned from the display, his steps measured as he walked toward the central war table. Around him, his remaining officers stood like silent statues, their eyes dim with exhaustion. This was no longer a fleet. It was the last gathering of the damned. Zavak's claws tapped the edge of the war table. We need contingencies. Luthar leaned forward. For what? For everything. Zavak activated a tactical projection, an old simulation of the Coalition's defensive protocols. A network of supply routes, strongholds, and fallback positions flickered before them. It was outdated. The war had rendered it a relic before it had even been deployed. But he wasn't looking for victory anymore. He was looking for survival. He keyed in a new sequence, removing all compromised locations from the display. Slowly, their empire shrank. What had once been a dominion stretching across dozens of systems now dwindled to scattered embers of control. "This is what we have left," Zivak said. "Akar Bastion is the last functional stronghold within our reach. We need to assume it is compromised." Luther straightened. "If the humans control it—" Zivak's ridges darkened. "Then we do not engage. We retreat." The words tasted bitter. The thought of retreating from their own outpost felt like peeling off his own skin, exposing something raw and vulnerable underneath. But pride was a corpse now, rotting in the silence between transmissions. Luther's voice tightened. "And if it's intact? Then we reinforce it." Zivak's eyes sharpened. "And we make sure it stays that way." The officers around the table exchanged glances. Finally, one of them, Vekris, a communications specialist, stepped forward. "With all due respect, High Commander," he said, voice rough, "what does that look like? What is our contingency?" Zivak studied the man. Vekris had always been one of the more cautious officers, his mind wired for logistics rather than battle. He had been right to survive this long. "Our ships are compromised," Zivak said. "Our command network is severed. If we stay on the defensive, we die in the dark. The humans will wait us out. We need a fence." The war table shifted again. The outpost layout appeared, a sprawling network of stations, repair bays, and orbital defense platforms. Akar Bastion had been built as a fortress world, its sole purpose to serve as a shielded redoubt for fleet command. Now it would become something else. A trap. Luther exhaled. "You mean to lure them in?" Zivak's claws traced the station's outer perimeter. "If the humans have left it intact, they will be watching it. They'll assume we will use it as a defensive fallback." His eyes darkened. "So we don't." Vekris frowned. "Then what do we do?" "We make them think they've won again." Zivak's mind moved like a blade through old war doctrines, severing useless ideas, leaving only what remained practical. The humans had fought with misdirection, deception, and control over the battlefield before the first shot was even fired. If the coalition was going to survive, they had to become something else. He keyed in a new sequence. The layout shifted. Instead of reinforcing Akar Bastion, the simulation restructured it. Instead of a stronghold, it became a weapon, a deadfall. "We give them exactly what they expect," Zivak said, "a desperate, dying empire scrambling to hold on to its last foothold. We make them watch us gather forces there, make them think we are preparing for one final stand." Vekris swallowed. "And then?" Zivak's eyes gleamed coldly. "And then we let them come." Luther frowned. "You want to draw them in?" "Yes." Zivak's claws flexed. "We make them commit resources, make them believe they need to finish the job." He tapped the war table. "And then we detonate the station." The silence stretched. Vekris looked pale beneath his ridges. "You're talking about suiciding our last stronghold." Zivak's expression did not change. "I'm talking about teaching them fear." The humans had given them time, had let them live. That was their first mistake. Zivak activated a tactical projection, an old simulation of the Coalition's defensive protocols. A network of supply routes, strongholds, and fallback positions flickered before them. It was outdated. The war had rendered it a relic before it had even been deployed. But he wasn't looking for victory anymore. He was looking for survival. He keyed in a new sequence, removing all compromised locations from the display. Slowly, their empire shrank. What had once been a dominion stretching across dozens of systems now dwindled to scattered embers of control. "This is what we have left," Zivak said. "Akar Bastion is the last functional stronghold within our reach. We need to assume it is compromised." Luther straightened. "If the humans control it—" Zivak's ridges darkened. "Then we do not engage. We retreat." The words tasted bitter. The thought of retreating from their own outpost felt like peeling off his own skin, exposing something raw and vulnerable underneath. But pride was a corpse now, rotting in the silence between transmissions. Luther's voice tightened. "And if it's intact? Then we reinforce it." Zivak's eyes sharpened. "And we make sure it stays that way." The officers around the table exchanged glances. Finally, one of them, Vekris, a communications specialist, stepped forward. "With all due respect, High Commander," he said, voice rough, "what does that look like? What is our contingency?" Zivak studied the man. Vekris had always been one of the more cautious officers, his mind wired for logistics rather than battle. He had been right to survive this long. "Our ships are compromised," Zivak said. "Our command network is severed. If we stay on the defensive, we die in the dark. The humans will wait us out. We need a fence." The war table shifted again. The outpost layout appeared, a sprawling network of stations, repair bays, and orbital defense platforms. Akar Bastion had been built as a fortress world, its sole purpose to serve as a shielded redoubt for fleet command. Now it would become something else. A trap. Luther exhaled. "You mean to lure them in?" Zivak's claws traced the station's outer perimeter. "If the humans have left it intact, they will be watching it. They'll assume we will use it as a defensive fallback." His eyes darkened. "So we don't." Vekris frowned. "Then what do we do?" "We make them think they've won again." Zivak's mind moved like a blade through old war doctrines, severing useless ideas, leaving only what remained practical. The humans had fought with misdirection, deception, and control over the battlefield before the first shot was even fired. If the coalition was going to survive, they had to become something else. He keyed in a new sequence. The layout shifted. Instead of reinforcing Akar Bastion, the simulation restructured it. Instead of a stronghold, it became a weapon, a deadfall. "We give them exactly what they expect," Zivak said, "a desperate, dying empire scrambling to hold on to its last foothold. We make them watch us gather forces there, make them think we are preparing for one final stand." Vekris swallowed. "And then?" Zivak's eyes gleamed coldly. "And then we let them come." Luther frowned. "You want to draw them in?" "Yes." Zivak's claws flexed. "We make them commit resources, make them believe they need to finish the job." He tapped the war table. "And then we detonate the station." The silence stretched. Vekris looked pale beneath his ridges. "You're talking about suiciding our last stronghold." Zivak's expression did not change. "I'm talking about teaching them fear." The humans had given them time, had let them live. That was their first mistake. Zivak activated a tactical projection, an old simulation of the Coalition's defensive protocols. A network of supply routes, strongholds, and fallback positions flickered before them. It was outdated. The war had rendered it a relic before it had even been deployed. But he wasn't looking for victory anymore. He was looking for survival. He keyed in a new sequence, removing all compromised locations from the display. Slowly, their empire shrank. What had once been a dominion stretching across dozens of systems now dwindled to scattered embers of control. "This is what we have left," Zivak said. Akar Bastion is the last functional stronghold within our reach. We need to assume it is compromised. Luther straightened. If the humans control it, Zivak's ridges darkened. Then we do not engage. We retreat. The words tasted bitter. The thought of retreating from their own outpost felt like peeling off his own skin, exposing something raw and vulnerable underneath. But pride was a corpse now, rotting in the silence between transmissions. Luther's voice tightened. And if it's intact, then we reinforce it. Zivak's eyes sharpened, and we make sure it stays that way. The officers around the table exchanged glances. Finally, one of them, Vekris, a communications specialist, stepped forward. With all due respect, High Commander, he said, voice rough, what does that look like? What is our contingency? Zivak studied the man. Vekris had always been one of the more cautious officers, his mind wired for logistics rather than battle. He had been right to survive this long. Our ships are compromised, Zivak said. Our command network is severed. If we stay on the defensive, we die in the dark. The humans will wait us out. We need a fence. The war table shifted again. The outpost layout appeared, a sprawling network of stations, repair bays, and orbital defense platforms. Akar Bastion had been built as a fortress world, its sole purpose to serve as a shielded redoubt for fleet command. Now it would become something else. A trap. Luther exhaled. You mean to lure them in? Zivak's claws traced the station's outer perimeter. If the humans have left it intact, they will be watching it. They'll assume we will use it as a defensive fallback. His eyes darkened. So we don't. Vekris frowned. Then what do? We make them think they've won again. Zivak's mind moved like a blade through old war doctrines, severing useless ideas, leaving only what remained practical. The humans had fought with misdirection, deception, and control over the battlefield before the first shot was even fired. If the coalition was going to survive, they had to become something else. He keyed in a new sequence. The layout shifted. Instead of reinforcing Akar Bastion, the simulation restructured it. Instead of a stronghold, it became a weapon, a deadfall. We give them exactly what they expect, Zivak said, a desperate, dying empire scrambling to hold on to its last foothold. We make them watch us gather forces there, make them think we are preparing for one final stand. Vekris swallowed. And then? Zivak's eyes gleamed coldly. And then we let them come. Luther frowned. You want to draw them in? Yes. Zivak's claws flexed. We make them commit resources, make them believe they need to finish the job. He tapped the war table. And then we detonate the station. The silence stretched. Vekris looked pale beneath his ridges. You're talking about suiciding our last stronghold. Zivak's expression did not change. I'm talking about teaching them fear. The humans had given them time, had let them live. That was their first mistake. We are still here. The fleet drifted closer, the station growing larger on the display. Data feeds scrolled across the console, tracking external structures, heat signatures, energy fluctuations, everything needed to make the final decision. Luthar's claws tapped against his console. If we're doing this, we need to execute flawlessly. A single misstep and... Zivak cut him off. There will be no misstep. Luthar hesitated, then nodded. The detonation sequence is primed. Once the humans move in, they won't move in. Zivak exhaled, his gaze steady. They'll wait, just like before. He gestured toward the wreckage left in the wake of the war. Fractured ships, dead signals, fading distress calls looping endlessly through empty corridors. The remains of an empire caught in its own failure. They believe they've won, Zivac said, voice measured, that we are no longer a threat. Luther exhaled through his teeth. And we teach them otherwise. Zivac's mandibles twitched. We make them remember. He turned to the bridge officers. Signal the fleet. Keep transmissions broken, sporadic. Make it look like we're scrambling for control. Let them watch us fumble. Let them believe we are desperate. Luther relayed the orders, his voice steady but edged with something new, something close to purpose. The officers moved quickly, their hands flying over controls, sending fragmented signals across the black. The station loomed closer, its docking ports gaping like an open wound. Still, the humans did not move. Good. Zivac activated his command console, bringing up the final sequence. Akar Bastion's reactor core flickered on the display. A heart that should have been dead, but pulsed weakly beneath the surface. It was waiting. So were the humans. Zivac pressed a command key. Deploy the final broadcast. A new signal flickered through the void. A distress call, one designed to sound like a last, desperate plea from a dying empire. One that the humans could not ignore. Luther's eyes darted toward him. And if they don't take the bait, they will. Zivac's ridges darkened, because they are still watching. Luther's throat worked. Then we wait? Zivac's voice was like steel. Yes. The station drew closer. The silence stretched. Then, the first human ship moved, a shadow against the stars, small, subtle, a reconnaissance vessel. Then another, and another. Zivac's claws flexed. Begin the detonation cycle. Luther's fingers hovered over the sequence key. Timer set for 3 minutes. Zivac nodded. Make sure they see it. The humans were careful, watching from a distance. Calculating. Always calculating. They did not know that Akar Bastion's core was already in meltdown, that the station would not simply collapse, it would consume. Luther's voice was tight. 1 minute. Zivac exhaled slowly. This was not a counterstrike. This was a lesson, a warning written in fire. The seconds ticked away. And then Akar Bastion detonated, a sun igniting from the inside out. Zivac watched as the first human vessels reacted, pulling away, attempting to escape the pull of the blast. Too late. The station's destruction was not just an explosion. It was a trap. Shock waves rippled through the sector, distortions tearing through the wreckage. Fields of burning debris turned into an avalanche. Not shrapnel, not wreckage, but war made new. And the humans? They had come too close. Their waiting ships were caught. Zivac's chest rose, his claws tightening. Now they understand. Luther exhaled sharply, watching the wreckage scatter across the display. We did it. Zivac's voice came cold. We started it. The war as it was had ended, but the real war had only begun. The humans had thought themselves the final force. Now they had learned a new truth. The coalition would never be finished. And the next time the humans looked to the darkness, they would remember. They would fear. Zivac turned to his officers, his voice a promise. They thought us broken. His ridges darkened. They thought this was over. His claws flexed. They thought I was paranoid. He turned back to the display where the fire still burned. Until the first strike landed,